coming out. Same with demonstrations against the Iraq War. So, you know, these people have come out, but they were always so terrified and afraid of the state security forces who, you know, we talk about the militarization of Egypt under Mubarak, but when you really look at it, if you start from, you know, the peace accords with Israel that Sadat signed, you can draw two lines. One of them is the kind of standing army, their numbers, and the other one is the state security, or the central security apparatus that goes up to the point to where, I think one figure I read said there were about 400,000 people in the army and about 1.7 million in the security apparatus. And so this was an internal army meant for just the kind of policing and repression of the people. It, you know, this was a system that had come to conceive of its own citizens as threats at any point of their own speaking out, or any point in their own kind of like claiming any sort of the normal political rights that we kind of think of. And so, you know, then Tunisia happens, and Bouazizi sets himself on fire, and there's 6 immolations after the fall of Ben Ali in Egypt. People trying to basically set themselves on fire, kill themselves in protest. This is coming off of the wake of last year, a young man named Khalid Said was beaten to death in public by policemen after refusing to give a bribe to officers in a cyber cafe. Photos of his body were spread around. This Facebook group that you may have heard of had 700,000 members in it, and I'm sure that the pictures had much wider reach than that. So he became a symbol of just this horrific kind of, immediately kind of repressive apparatus. And then of course the labor strikes that we talked about. And 25th, a lot of you might not know, is actually, it's Police Day. It's a national holiday that actually commemorates an incident back during the kind of British protectorate period, the details of which aren't necessarily relevant, but people were being told that they should bring chocolates and flowers to the police on this day, and so I think in their own way they did bring them a gift. And you know, so the 25th started it, and in some people's minds it didn't. Some people, you know, I was talking to and other activists were saying that no, it was the 11th. When Mubarak steps down, that's when the revolution began. But what the 25th did, I think, talking with friends of mine who were there, was to just, you know, we've heard the breaking the barrier of fear. But I think what it really was just, there was these moments where people were breaking through police lines for some of the first times. Your normal protest in Egypt, you know, okay, we're going to meet in Tahrir. There's, you know, maybe 100 people show up, and before anyone else gets there, there's maybe 1,000 riot police and, you know, an equal company of just a bunch of paid thugs cracking their knuckles in leather jackets and this sort of thing. And so they used this kind of, you know, preemptive kind of like overwhelming force superiority kind of technique effectively for a long time. But I think people surprised them with good tactics. I think the numbers, of course, you know, have to do with just the compounding of all these causes, but there was a change. Part of it was a manual that was circulating around that was basically an incredibly kind of intricate knowledge of these security force tactics, and also knowledge of points in the city and ideas of how to occupy them, how to assemble so that you basically don't get preempted by police and this sort of thing. And the really funny thing is a lot of the people leading the initial protests were the ultras, like these kids who were supporters of one of the big soccer teams who would go out after every soccer match and get the shit kicked out of them by police, you know, while they were partying. And so they came to kind of know how to work this. And so you'd see them going through, they had whistles and they would like form wedges and they'd go and then they'd switch lines. Like these guys were, kids were just hardcore. And so you have these moments where police lines get broken. They were too spread thin, they weren't expecting it, and I think that moment was just a complete change. People start running then through the streets and laughing and calling down to people in balconies and saying, we've done it, we've done it, we've done it, come join us, come join us. Like, you know, this just exuberance, I think, that came from knowing that they could be beaten even in some small way, I think was the beginning of the end for the regime. Like, it wasn't that it was fait accompli, but that it couldn't be the same after that point. And I think that, you know, knowing that that had already happened was just amazing to me, so I had to go. So then, after that Monday, protesters are driven out of the square by hundreds of tear gas canisters and just an attack at 2 a.m. They come back Friday, though, in huge numbers, assembling at all of the local mosques after the prayers, you know, again, kind of using this distributed strategy and then only then moving on to these key points. And, you know, you know, it's hard to say whether they routed the police or whether this was intentional. You know, there was a lot of really sneaky, underhanded moves being done by the Ministry of the Interior the whole time. But the army came in and the police disappeared. And they're still not back on the streets. I think part of it was they were definitely afraid that they were going to get theirs in some small way, but I think that this was a technique by the regime to basically terrorize the people into thinking that they were in the midst of chaos, you know, kind of I'll show you what protests bring. And that same weekend, you know, my parents were very worried because there had been reports of looting, but at the same time, immediately you had these citizen councils, these groups of young people and old people kind of block by block coming out, setting up cordons around their streets, checking people who went through, and they were catching people with police IDs and weapons in the trunks of cars. And so it was very clear what was going on. It was an attempt to scare everyone back home, but people didn't go home. And people actually kept coming to the square, and the day that I arrived was the first one of these million-person marches, these million-person demonstrations, and I came and I saw Egypt as, you know, or I saw places I'd never really seen it before. It was amazing that you went there and people were kind of having this festival, but it was just kind of everyone was participating in it themselves and together. There was no kind of act to follow up on. And people were speaking in ways that you had never heard them speak, whether it was making jokes, saying chants, talking politics, that you did not hear people speak like this in public. And I mean, you hardly see people kind of going out like this in public ever. So this kind of just huge just explosion of all these energies, whether they were youthful or old, you know, and this kind of change in attitudes was happening, and it was really exciting. I think for me definitely, but for these, you know, for all these other Egyptians, I think it was just overwhelming. You know, and I hope you don't mind I'm giving a sort of a timeline for, you know, but you know, that same night, you know, just to illustrate kind of what was happening behind the scenes, Mubarak gives a really inflammatory speech. This is his second one, I think. Says he's not stepping down. Everyone's worried because it's very aggressive, very patronizing, and you start hearing reports of confrontations. I think some of the first skirmishes were in Alexandria, and so we woke up the next day really anxious, and then I went with a friend to go take a shower and get some bags, and on our way back we started seeing these just kind of like big gangs of supposed pro-Mubarak supporters that we've all heard of, and I hope that no one thinks they're actually real anymore. You know, just burly dudes with really, really well-printed posters, riding in the backs of trucks, screaming, you know. And, you know, there's a word in Arabic, baltageya, which means thug, and it's a particular type of paid thug that the government usually brings out. And so we knew that this was what this was. And so by the time we make it to the square that day, we find that we're effectively surrounded at this point. And they had come in with horses and camels, and they were trying to attack people, and that was kind of half comic, half terrifying. Those horses, by the way, were released on a family farm, not in the like dead pet way, but actually released on a family farm. But you know, and again, that night was the one that you saw on TV with the Molotovs and the barricades and the stones, and you know, the snipers. Even there were people being shot, probably by police in plain clothes. You know, Robert Fisk reported on that same day that there were orders to fire, orders to the army to fire on all the protesters in the square and disperse them. They didn't do that, fortunately. You could tell that there was a serious amount of tension in all these low-level officers who, despite the kind of issues and the kind of mistrust that one should have for the Egyptian army, a lot of these guys on the bottom, it wasn't a coup by any means, they weren't taking action, but it seemed like at a lot of points they were having moral qualms and hesitations and showing varying degrees of support that were, if not decisive, then definitely you know, something to be thankful for. That being said, they pulled away later, the army, and that's when those battles started. And so at this point, spirits are incredibly low. People are afraid of a possible repeat of this. The army said that they wouldn't let it happen again, but you know, as a consequence, the sort of propaganda machine of the state media shifted. You start having them accusing people of being foreign agents, provocateurs, and this sort of thing. And now, instead of being a kind of frontal attack on the square, what happens was you started seeing people everywhere getting harassed, getting attacked, you know, particularly foreigners, but even Egyptians being accused strangely of being foreigners, you know, people who'd never left the country in their whole lives. You know, just more of this kind of installation of panic and attempting to kind of scare people home, get people away. And everyone was very worried. And then, you know, the next milestone, I suppose, is this young man, Wael Ghanim, who everyone may have heard of at this point, who was probably the moderator of one of this We Are All Khaled Said Facebook page. He had been abducted, amongst many others, on the 25th, and had been held in detention for 12 days blindfolded. You know, he was probably treated better than a lot, you know, but it was still probably a very harrowing experience, and one of the TV presenters brought him on, did an extended interview with him, which I think had a pretty strong effect on a lot of the people sitting at home, a lot of the Egyptian people, and I think on parents who he made a direct address to, because he was a young man working for Google, you know, like very respectable, kind of like, you know, not a foreign agent receiving bribes from the American embassy, you know, like it was a chance for, you know, some of these initial demands to be voiced in a way that was kind of cogent and clear. And I think it shifted the tone of what happened to where the next day you went to the square and it was just people coming in, and all these people who had not been there, who maybe even were against this whole idea, who had no idea what was going on or who had been lied to, were just coming in and just like dropping, you know, seeing the kind of devastation of the nights before, and just, you know, I saw people just weeping and apologizing and saying that they were sorry that they weren't there. And so you started seeing the square as a kind of territorial space within the city becoming a kind of place where people would arrive and partake in this atmosphere, and there was these transformations that were happening, and people would go and just be walking around and enjoying it and see concerts and see people talking and see poetry reading and this sort of thing. And this is when something of a revolutionary mindset, at least in terms of a change in subjectivities, if not in terms of let's go take everything by storm, starts basically affecting everyone in the country at large. And momentum continues to pick up until, you know, we're under the impression that this was, I think, Thursday night, that Mubarak's going to resign. He gives a speech. Before he's even done, it's clear that he's not going to resign, and this is when people move from the square. They had been at that point at the square and in front of the street of the parliament. They moved to the TV building and the palace, the kind of symbolic sites maybe of previous revolutions. And, you know, at that point it's less than a day before the resignation comes down. And, you know, that resignation caused days of just celebration. And it was also just another pretty overwhelming experience. You know, it didn't end it. I think that there's a lot of issues still in place. You know, Snehal mentioned labor, and they really, whereas they may have been in these kind of things before, it was really interesting to start seeing the strikes begin, and, you know, labor claiming a voice that it had been prevented by the corruption of this trade union federation for years. I went to a demonstration a couple days after Mubarak's resignation at the Trade Union Federation headquarters, which is basically just a hub of corruption, if one can imagine, where there were several hundred of these kind of union leaders and organizers there protesting, asking basically to be given the keys to the building. They wanted to go in, occupy it, depose the current head, who is a political appointee of the National Democratic Party, the former party, you know, and claim, you know, an autonomous kind of independent union system. We were attacked, As people attempted to enter the building, people were throwing chairs and rocks